Hello and welcome to today's webinar, an introduction to the Committee on Heraldry at American Ancestors. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Vice President of Education and Programming here at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator for today's program. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. This program today is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. Our speaker today is Dr. Nathaniel Lane Taylor, editor and publisher of the American Genealogist and a specialist in medieval Europe. He taught medieval and modern history at Harvard and elsewhere for 15 years, including the social, political, and military origins of heraldry at the time of the Crusades. His genealogical research spans from medieval Spain, France, and Britain to colonial New England and Virginia. He has been on the American Ancestors Committee on Heraldry since 2006 and is now its registrar. He was elected a Fellow of the American Society of Genealogists in 2011 and is chairman of the Scientific Committee for the 36th International Congress of Genealogical and Heraldic Sciences, which will be held in Boston September of next year. Now, the Committee on Heraldry at American Ancestors is the oldest non-governmental heraldic body in the world. Established in 1864, its purpose is to collect and preserve information in regard to heraldry. The committee's heraldic interests are national in scope, embracing the use of heraldry and coats of arms throughout the current United States and its colonial predecessors. During today's presentation, you'll learn more about the history of the committee, its publications, and how to enroll your arms. Dr. Taylor will present for about 45 minutes and then answer as many questions as he can in the remaining 10 to 15 minutes of the hour. At any point during the presentation, go ahead and type your query into that Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. Our instructor has also produced a free resource guide that will be available on our website alongside the recording of this event later today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Ginevra, for this opportunity to present a webinar about the Committee on Heraldry here at American Ancestors. This is a little bit of a sequel to my recent webinar, An Introduction to Heraldry for Genealogists, from a couple of months ago. I'm a genealogist, as Ginevra said, the editor of the American Genealogist, and I specialize in colonial and earlier genealogy. But I also specialize in heraldry, and I've been a volunteer on the Committee on Heraldry here at American Ancestors since 2006, which is only 17 out of its 159 years. As some of you already know, the New England Historic Genealogical Society, now also named American Ancestors, is the oldest and largest nonprofit genealogical organization in the country. It was founded in 1845, which means it's a direct institutional link to the early Victorian era, which saw a great surge of interest in family history. While rooted in Boston in New England, American Ancestors very early on became a national institution and a national resource, and our Committee on Heraldry is no exception to that. Our committee was established within American Ancestors in 1864, and as Ginevra said, this does make us the oldest non-governmental organization in the world concerned with the study of heraldry. We have our own page at the American Ancestors website, and this screenshot shows you how to get to it. You reach it from the menu Signature Projects at the upper right and pull down to the Committee on Heraldry. But we're more than a project. We've been around for most of the many years that American Ancestors has. So our page describes the committee and some of our projects, including how people can enroll coats of arms in one of our ongoing series, and that's what I'll come back to in detail later. So what does genealogy have to do with heraldry? Why do we exist and exist within American Ancestors? This Venn diagram explains it a little. It's something I spoke about more in my September webinar. I add history to this Venn diagram too, because it's really one of the ways in which these two intersect. And I'm a historian, so I always think about the history of both of these fields. But definitions are the key. Heraldry can be defined, this is the next slide, Heraldry can be defined as either a convention of graphic design, often called a coat of arms, and everything related to those designs, or more broadly, heraldry can also be defined as anything having to do with heralds. And heralds were medieval professionals who, because they were first tasked with tracing who used what coat of arms, they essentially became the first genealogists in pre-modern Europe. So with those overlapping definitions in mind, it's no wonder that the fields of genealogy and heraldry have always had parallel lives. And this next slide shows really the history, something of the history of the sister fields. I spoke more on this in my September webinar. Briefly, heraldry has traditionally been considered as a sister discipline of genealogy. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, interest in them went hand in hand. But in the later 20th century, heraldry was left behind a little bit as the field of genealogy evolved with new methods, new sources, and new kind of demographic focuses of interest. The last genealogy textbook with a heraldry chapter in it was published in 1977, and that's just about the same year that the publication of Roots and the television show based on that really spurred the renaissance or revolution in genealogy of the end of the 20th century. Heraldry has had a revolution or a renaissance a little bit later, more delayed. By most measures, it's a 21st century phenomenon, and it's something that we're enjoying right now. We'll come back to that later. But let's go back to 1864, and it's worth going back even further to the cultural climate that spawned our committee. A few background elements of heraldry in America are important. Before independence, as the 13 colonies, we were part of the United Kingdom, which was among a minority of European countries that had a system of government heraldic regulation. But our colonies across an ocean were beyond the effective regulatory reach, and plenty of the colonists also had come from other countries with no traditions of heraldic regulation. So in America, we used and enjoyed heraldry, and this interest didn't disappear after the Revolution. In the 19th century, our interest in tracing our family roots grew steadily, especially linking Americans to various mother countries in Europe. The New England Historic Genealogical Society was founded in 1845. Heraldry was seen as an integral part of it then. The first heraldry book in the United States was published in New York in 1851. By the time of the Civil War, heraldry was a common enough subject that it even had a political angle. The Cavalier Dismounted, and this is the little picture at the corner of your slide here. The Cavalier Dismounted was the title of an essay by William Whitmore, one of the founders of our committee. And it was written in 1863 to counter arguments by the Southern planter aristocracy who considered themselves socially superior to Northerners. And they cited heraldry, the use of coats of arms, as evidence of that. Whitmore, a committed genealogist, argued that a greater proportion of New Englanders and New Yorkers were actually descended from gentry and had coats of arms, or were entitled to them, than our Southern neighbors. I'm not sure he was right, but he was very committed to this idea and this competition. And that's one of the things that gave birth to the committee. So in 1864, the Committee on Heraldry was established as a standing committee within the New England Historic Genealogical Society, quote, to collect and preserve information in regard to heraldry, unquote. And that simple charge covers what we've been doing ever since. Now, in that time, in the Victorian era and the 20th century, there were many such committees within this organization. The Committee on Cemeteries, the Committee on English and Foreign Research, and others. In that era, American Ancestors was essentially an all-volunteer organization gathered around interest committees. But with its evolution into American Ancestors, a more complex service organization serving a national membership, that older model of volunteer researchers organized in thematic committees has really given way to a different model of service and research. So our Standing Committee on Heraldry is the last of these old committees. So what does our committee do? Well, we can start by looking at what they did early on in what I think of as the first golden age of the committee in the years immediately after it was founded. So William Whitmore, the same guy who wrote a polemic about whether Northerners or Southerners had more coats of arms, in 1866, just after the war, he published The Elements of Heraldry. It's the first systematic book about heraldry published in America. And it's not a bad introduction to heraldry, even by today's standards. And you can find it online. I've linked online copies of many of the older books I mentioned in the resource guide. Accompanying this more general work, the next slide shows us the scholarly journal called the Heraldic Journal that was published over 4 years from 1865 to 1868. And all the editors were the first members of the Committee on Heraldry. It combines careful studies of heraldic artifacts, gravestones and seals and other things, with genealogies of some of the families who used coats of arms in New England and beyond. Many of its articles are still useful today, including engraved drawings of seals and artifacts that are no longer available. They've been lost since. The Heraldic Journal was discontinued after 4 years, not because of lack of interest, but because the editors wanted more time to do other research. Now, these early members of the Committee on Heraldry, most of them were swayed by the general attitude and tone of most English scholars and writers on heraldry, for whom the only authentic heraldry was what was sanctioned by government officials, the heralds. In 1868, Whitmore actually proposed that the United States government regulate and tax heraldry. But I think wisely, our state and federal governments have never gone down that path. But appetites for heraldry grew in the late 19th century. Some of the heraldic experts, including committee members, were frustrated. They endorsed a restrictive view of government-regulated heraldry, and they disparaged the kind of free use of coats of arms without any such regulation. In its annual report for 1898, the Committee on Heraldry, in a discouraged tone, actually urged Americans to abandon heraldry altogether. It's an odd position for a Committee on Heraldry. They wrote, quote, "As there is no person and no institution in the United States with authority to regulate coats of arms, your committee discourages their display in any way or form." Well, that was pretty negative and pretty dark. On the other hand, other committee members, and this is the next slide, also recognized the abundance and value of American heraldic usage, and including art and artifacts. In 1874, the committee proposed to collect information on such arms as families here or in other places might consider their own, without focusing on whether they had been granted by government authorities in British traditions. So this research-oriented current won out over the kind of regulatory attitude of the 1898 denunciation. And there was a change of personnel and a change of heart in the committee at the turn of the century. In 1914, the committee not only decided that it seems not only proper but desirable that arms should be displayed in a variety of ways, they proposed a new plan to systematically record coats of arms. And this is the roll of arms that began in 1914. It began with this proposal that anyone interested in, quote, making it a matter of record that any original settler in this country inherited a coat of arms, or that any inhabitant of this country received a grant of arms, be invited to offer the arms for record with this society, together with the evidence for those arms. This emphasis on inheritance meant that the roll of arms was based on genealogy, descent of a settler from an ancestor using a coat of arms in the home country. The roll began with registration number 1, choosing President Washington's immigrant ancestor, John Washington, of Virginia, as the very first entry in the roll of arms. That signaled this was a national project. It's no longer just a New England project, and it's no longer imbued with this competition idea of North versus South coming out of the Civil War. The second entry in the roll of arms was reserved for Samuel Appleton, the immigrant ancestor of 2 early members of the Committee on Heraldry. So the roll of arms got going formally in 1916, and this is the hand-painted manuscript page of the entry for John Washington of Virginia, who's the ancestor of President George Washington. Now, the resource guide has live links to various entries serialized in the register, et cetera. I'll get to that a little later. The committee members prepared this manuscript, though, for public inspection in the American Ancestors Library in Boston. And it's fascinating because it was designed to be a public document, but it was a one-off. It was handwritten and hand-painted. This manuscript was continuously maintained through 1945. The first 378 entries in the roll of arms. Each one corresponds to one of these gorgeous manuscript pages with the hand-painted coats of arms. After 1945, after number 378, the practice was dropped, and the roll has continued ever since as a publication-only project. The coats of arms are all still illustrated, but only in black and white, as they have been printed in every serialized portion of the roll of arms. Now, for some of the earliest entries in the roll, including this one for John Washington, the manuscript contains information not included in the published version, so it's useful to consult this one as well. We'll come back to how to do that in a moment. So the basic statistics, this is a continuing project. It's 109 years old now. There are 978 entries in the roll of arms as of our last quarterly meeting. 813 of those have been published. Immigrants in the roll of arms come from over 20 European countries, plus Western Hemisphere countries like Haiti, Canada, and Mexico. Immigrants from the 16th century, the leaders of the lost Roanoke colony are in there, down through the 20th century are included. We're currently adding about 20 entries per year, and the modern entries are much more detailed and include footnoted documentation in their published form, and that sort of makes up for the fact that we're not hand illuminating a manuscript with a page for each entry as we keep going in the 21st century. So a first way to consult the roll of arms is the online index on the committee webpage at American Ancestors. And this is simply a long spreadsheet from numbers 1 down to, it should be all the way to 978, but I think the last quarterly update or 2 updates have not been entered in what's on the website. And it's a name index. It tells you what colony, if it was before, or what state, if it was after independence, the immigrants settled in, roughly what year they came, and what country they came from. Well, the first 8 entries you see here are all English, but as I've said, the roll has grown much more diverse in its 109 years, and over 20 countries of origin are represented. Most roll entries are based fundamentally on the genealogical connection between an immigrant and an ancestor in the mother country who rightfully used a coat of arms, either in a country where they're regulated or was documented as using a particular coat of arms in a country where there's no regulation. Many entries have had substantive amendments published in subsequent installments of the roll of arms, and I'll show you how to get to those in a moment as well. This is the database entry. So in the meta combined database search window at American Ancestors, you can search a database called the Roll of Arms, and that returns entries only to the manuscript version of the roll, which is the first 378 entries. But as I've said, those are extremely valuable to look at, as well as most of them being quite artistically pleasing, because for many of those early entries, those manuscript pages have more information than what was published in the register. So this is, as I've said, the complete name index to the roll that brings us all the way down into the 900s is currently not included in the integrated search function of the databases at American Ancestors. But for all the entries that have been published in the register, you should be able to find, searching the name of the person, you should be able to find page references within the register to those folks as well. The next slide, I think, shows us the Appleton page. This is roll of arms entry number 2. We were looking at Washington just a moment ago. And so Appleton was the immigrant ancestor of one of the of two of the early committee members, William Sumner Appleton, father and son. And you see here the information that's captured from the page that's returned in the database entry for this. This is entry number 2, or page 2, in volume 1 of the 5 volumes corresponding to the first 5 parts of the roll of arms. Now, they've also been published, as I've said, and so it's been published in installments since 1928. Almost all of the installments have appeared in the Register and can be consulted through American Ancestors' website in the Register online. In the resource guide, I've given a detailed table of which issues of the Register contain parts of the roll of arms, and that guide has live links to bring up those individual pages at American Ancestors. But the best way to consult the first 10 parts of the roll of arms, entries 1 to 741 altogether, is in the single volume reprint edition of parts 1 through 10, with introduction, addenda, and corrections. It was published in 2013 and can be purchased at American Ancestors. That's the book to the right on this slide. It contains, various things not available online, including some corrections and a small set of entries that missed being published in the Register in the 1990s. The most recent part of the poll, the roll of arms published since then, appeared in the Register in 2022, and it's forthcoming as its own book within a couple of months, and that's the darker blue, the roll of arms 11th part, which is entries 742 to 813. The roll of arms 12th part will start appearing serially in the Register next year as well. Now, in addition to the published entries, the committee has also produced certificates like this, attesting that a certain coat of arms is in the roll of arms or has otherwise been recorded, if it's a modern coat of arms. We'll get to that in a moment. This certificate's from the 1930s, and it's signed by longtime committee secretary, Dr. Harold Bowditch. And it's actually for his own coat of arms, the Bowditch coat of arms, registered as number 22 in the roll, for his patrilineal ancestor, William Bowditch, who settled in Salem in 1671. Now, some of the members of the committee have been drawn to the field by learning about their own ancestral connection to an authentic early coat of arms. And I think this is true of Dr. Bowditch. Others of us have come to it through our interests or scholarly interests. I myself have no coat of arms, either inherited or newly designed. We are reintroducing these hand-painted certificates that are going to be available for purchase for both for inherited arms that are registered in the roll of arms, as well as for modern new arms that are registered, recorded with us. And I'll get to those in a moment. But with Dr. Bowditch's certificate there, I wanted to give a little sidebar about 2 key scholars who were members of the committee for decades in the early 20th century. And I think of this era as the committee's second golden age, once the roll of arms was up and running in the 1920s down to the 1960s. Harold Bowditch was a Boston urologist, and he always told people he was not a genealogist, but a scholar of heraldry. And this underscores an important formula that the Committee on Heraldry has always had, cooperatively building on complementary expertise, some of us in genealogy and some in heraldry, which allows us to tackle complex projects, as we've been doing ever since Bowditch's day. Dr. Bowditch was extremely well organized and kept voluminous and meticulous records of the committee as its secretary. He was also a significant collector of heraldic artifacts and manuscripts, and his own personal collections, as well as things he acquired on behalf of the committee, form the core of the fantastic heraldic collections of American ancestors, and I'll get to those in a minute as well. Dr. Bowditch's exact contemporary and scholarly partner, Arthur Adams, is the other person I want to talk about for a minute. He was an English professor and a clergyman, and for decades was the librarian of Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And he would drive up to Boston and the Boston area for quarterly meetings at the committee. He was also a tireless leader in the hereditary society community, producing many reference works related to different aspects of mostly colonial genealogy. He was one of the founders of the American Society of Genealogists in 1940, an honorary society to which Bowditch was soon elected, although Bowditch continued to protest that he was not a genealogist. As partners for nearly 4 decades, Adams and Bowditch exemplified the partnership of these two disciplines within the work of the committee. Arthur Adams was also one of the key people responsible for establishing a new heraldic tradition in the 20th century for Americans with British ancestry, receiving an honorary grant of arms from English or Scottish government authorities. Arthur Adams's own coat of arms, shown here, was granted to him in 1923 by the English Kings of Arms and registered in our roll of arms in 1926, inaugurating our roll's long tradition of recording this kind of coat of arms along with inherited arms. And what you see here is the hand-painted vellum achievement of his coat of arms from the original parchment patent of his arms that were recently acquired just last year for the Heraldry collections at American Ancestors. So that leads us into this interesting sidelight of new coats of arms, modern arms. How did the roll of arms lead to the committee recording new coats of arms? In 1915, when the roll of arms was conceived and defined, new grants of arms to Americans by British heraldic officials did not exist. I've written an article on the two men who basically invented and spurred this trend. One was Arthur Adams, another was John Ross Delafield of New York. And the trend was based partly on the old Anglo-centric idea that the most valid arms are those granted by a government authority, even though no such requirement ever existed in the United States, nor in most European homelands of American immigrants other than Britain. So what you're looking at here is the roll of arms manuscript page for Arthur Adams's own coat of arms, and it says that it was granted to him in 1923. Modern grants like this, so brand new arms that were granted by British authorities, were added to the roll of arms from the 1920s until 1972, when finally roll of arms criteria were clarified to include only inherited arms predating 1900 with a genealogical justification for being brought over from the old country. And that excludes all these new coats of arms granted by foreign governments. Several dozen of these new arms, though, were still listed in the roll of arms if their entries were created in that period, 1923 to 1972. Newer coats of arms and coats of arms that were privately designed, not granted by government heralds, had never appeared in the roll of arms. And that's our next category. The roll of arms as originally conceived excluded arms that appeared in the United States with no apparent pre-immigration precedent, and it also excluded new coats of arms that were privately designed and adopted in recent times, while allowing new arms granted by foreign governments like Adams's. But scholars of heraldry and material culture have rightly been just as interested in all these other arms in those categories, as well as those with the better documentation of inheritance or government issue. And in 1933, the committee published views on the right and propriety of assuming arms, that is, adopting new arms that you design yourself or commission from a private artist. And so they began to record these, but in no sense to grant them. And that was part of the language that we don't grant arms, but we like to take note of what they are. And so since the 1930s, the committee has collected hundreds of records of new coats of arms of Americans, either privately designed or after 1972, obtained from foreign government officials. Now let's look at what we're doing with these new arms. This brings us into one of the major ongoing activities of the Committee on Heraldry, recording new coats of arms. Since the 1930s, we've collected, as I've said, about almost 400 of these, and about 100 of those are for institutions, and the rest of them are for personal arms. I haven't really spent a lot of time talking about institutional arms, but of course that's some of the most vibrant and most publicly visible heraldry in the modern United States. coats of arms of churches and schools, colleges, universities, really being perhaps the biggest category, and also the coats of arms that we see in the form of seals of various government jurisdictions, so cities, towns, municipalities, states, and of course our federal government as well. So since the 1930s, these have all been kept as paper files and never systematically published, either in textual form or with illustrations. And so for decades, this was something not widely known outside certain circles of heraldry enthusiasts, but we've been at it for quite a while. Only since 2020 have we systematically published new arms accepted for record. At present, these appear in our committee's annual reports, linked on our website. And we hope to be able to move forward with a retrospective roll of all arms recorded since 1934. That's one of the major projects awaiting us as we work towards making more of our collections and projects accessible. So what you see on the right-hand side of this slide is an application form for recording a coat of arms, a letter of confirmation, formal confirmation that arms have been accepted and recorded, and then at the very edge of the page, a portion of the formal list of new arms recorded in 2022, published in our annual report for that year. Now let's go through the process for enrolling arms. This is a frequent question, and actually a frequent question is how to do it. And it's similar. There's a similar process for submitting a new entry to the roll of arms for inherited arms as for submitting a new coat of arms to be entered into record. And let me say that applications for an entry in the roll of arms, arms inherited by an immigrant from the mother country, do not have to come from a descendant of that immigrant. So a lot of people have a scholarly interest in a particular immigrant that may not be their own ancestor and have brought to our attention a potential registration in the roll of arms without demonstrating any relationship to it. So we're a scholarly project. It's not a lineage society. Now, with new arms, the applicant is almost always the person who designed the arms or obtained them. And we record new arms in the name of the individual who brings them to us, or in the name of a parent or grandparent of an applicant. So if you wish to design and record a coat of arms to be used by siblings or cousins, you can do so. We don't record new arms assigned posthumously to an ancestor more distant than a grandparent. Now, for new arms, we also require them to be original, and that's the standards here. Not too close to any other known arms, and also to be minimally heraldic, really based on a kind of general consensus of different heraldic conventions from different European traditions. We don't require arms to adhere exactly to a particular European heraldic convention because different European countries really had different traditions and thresholds and standards. And in keeping with democratic traditions, we record only shields and crests without any of the additional components sometimes associated with rank or nobility in different heraldic jurisdictions. Now, I don't want to get into now anything else about designing coats of arms from scratch. My colleague Joe McMillan will be doing our next webinar on January 18th, specifically about the design process, designing your own coat of arms, and other things related to the idea of creating a new coat of arms for general use. Now, what do we do with these applications? We consider all applications at our quarterly meetings, and if they're accepted, there's an administrative fee of $50 to American Ancestors. We generate a formal letter of record, and then the arms are published either in the roll of arms or for new arms, our annual reports, depending on exactly what type of arms. So the webpage screenshot here really shows this whole category, this whole portion of our page, enrolling your arms. Here's where you can obtain the forms for recording new arms or older coats to be registered in the roll. They're simple one-page documents, and we always welcome adding relevant things to the applications And for new arms, you can submit them as a textual description, a blazon, and or a drawing. And sometimes if they don't quite match one another, we sort of discuss with the applicant the ideal intended form. Now, I'm just going to go into a little sidebar here. I've mentioned coats of arms of corporations and institutions, and I think you notice that we have our own seal and coat of arms on some of our documents. In one sense, these emblems hark back to the Anglo-centric origins of the Committee on Heraldry, with the sort of general sentiments that aligned up with English ancestry, privileged English or British ancestry. The first seal from 1915 on the left was something of an unsubtle ripoff of the coat of arms of the College of Arms in London. And that was decided that was not really correct to do. It was changed in 1934 to the next design, still based on a tabard, a sort of over tunic worn by heralds, but this one featuring a ship full of immigrants. And while it's still Anglo-centric because it features the English cross of St. George on the sail and on the flag, I like to think of it as a little bit more inclusive because immigration, that's symbolized by all the tiny people on the ship crossing the water, is common to the great majority of non-Indigenous Americans. Our ancestors came from all over the globe, and so that's a little bit of a development towards inclusivity. The images on the right at the top are the old seal of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, sort of a basis for these seals of the committee. And then at the bottom right, it's the committee's emblem rendered as a simple coat of arms, a much more kind of striking and multi-useful design. So this set of images, those emblems, have really lent us to the next thing I want to talk about. One of the greatest aspects of the Committee on Heraldry, and heretofore one of our least visible aspects, is the fantastic collection of committee records and heraldry collections at American Ancestors. Our committee's been gathering information and records and artifacts relating to heraldry since 1864. And not continue. Our records aren't perfectly continuous. We've got some gaps in our record keeping, but as one example, at the bottom of this collage, the handwritten page is the page of the documenting our first quarterly meeting on April 2nd, 1864. So we actually do have a pretty deep bench of our own operating records. And the great majority of our thematic records and files have not been digitized, but this is a big priority for me and for the committee. And I hope we can secure support. That's both manpower as well as other kinds of support for some of this work in the near future. Now, our operating records, like those of American Ancestors more generally, are unlikely to become databases accessible through the American Ancestors website. They're an important scholarly legacy and definitely contribute to our current ability to do what we do, to address queries, to work on all kinds of projects. More spectacularly, since even before 1864, scholars have been actively collecting and donating heraldry material to the collections at American Ancestors. The rest of this collage is just a scattering of highlights from these collections, many of which have never been seen and never exhibited publicly, and we do hope will be much more accessible in the next couple of years. I just want to show and tell two or three of the biggest highlights, and then wrap this up in the final few minutes with plenty of time, I hope, for questions. So one of the best known items in our heraldic collections is the gore roll. Since the 19th century, this has been recognized as the premier artifact representing heraldry in the colonies, that is to say the 13 colonies, and in New England, certainly. Its contents were published in text form back in the 1930s, but there is now a facsimile edition forthcoming this next year, and it was something that is destined to be more visible and better known as a foundation of heraldry as it was actually used in the colonies. But the gore roll is associated with another fantastic artifact, the next slide, not nearly as well known. but older. This is called a manuscript called the Promptuarium Armorum. It was painted by an English herald in 1602. It was brought to New England in 1657 by that man's successor in the office of herald, the Rouge Dragon Pursuivant. And it was handed down within New England, within Massachusetts, following the death of that man. Came over 1657, died in the 1680s. That was William Crown. And this made its way into the hands of the Gore family of painters, who used this as one of the bases, one of the sources of the Gore roll that they assembled 70 years later. This manuscript is fantastic, and it's enormous. It has thousands of coats of arms beautifully painted in it. It's a very, very high aesthetic standard. It's been in a very fragile condition for over a century, but it's this year and last year been carefully conserved and finally digitized, making it available for scholarly consultation this year for the first time since the 19th century. One other great treasure of British or English heraldry from before the colonial period begins, and it has its own story, is this single sheet of vellum, a patent of arms from the year 1480, from an English herald granting coat of arms to Christopher Brown of Lincolnshire. Now, this was purchased in the 19th century by a Boston Brown who thought he was a descendant of Christopher. It turns out he wasn't. That was based on a fraud. But he subsequently bequeathed this to American ancestors. We've held it for over a century. I think it's only been on display 2 or 3 times that I'm aware of. There's a complex saga behind this document, too long to go into now. But I do hope that this will be among the things exhibited next September, and we'll get to that in a moment. Just a couple other slides. Heraldic collections expand well beyond British material, and I think a lot of people will be relieved and interested to learn this. Harold Bowditch, in particular, was a great collector of material from German-speaking countries and elsewhere in continental Europe, things related to or including heraldry. The broader European scope of collections is represented by this piece. It's a charter from the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg from sometime before 1416. I think I'm one of the only people who's actually looked at this, at least in the last few decades, and I couldn't make out the date from the photos that I took with my iPhone a few months ago, but I believe it belongs to a duke who died in 1416. And it has 2 or 3 of its original heraldic seals still attached at the bottom. It probably would have had 3 or 4 more attached to those little tabs of parchment. This is actually among the very oldest items of any kind held by American ancestors. It's probably the oldest heraldic item in the collections of American ancestors. Now let's look at seals of a different kind. I love this one. Dr. Bowditch didn't just collect the sort of grand ancient heraldic artifacts for artistic value. He systematically gathered a study collection arranged in boxes and binders of seal impressions in wax like this, or engravings of coats of arms, personal, corporate, civic, from all over Europe and from all eras of heraldry, from the pre-modern era to the 20th century. It's probably the largest study collection of its kind in the United States, and it's almost entirely unknown. It's not digitized and only very, very superficially cataloged. It's my great hope that we can actually make inroads in organizing or reorganizing, digitizing, and generally making these things available. What I love about this particular example, that's why I took a picture of it the last time I was rooting around in there. For fans of the TV show Ted Lasso, you might have noticed that the fictional English football team, Richmond, uses this same design. It's the Lamb of God represented in a coat of arms. And they essentially lifted that from an actual English football team, soccer team, the Preston North End Football Club in the city of Preston, Lancashire, because it's the coat of arms of the city of Preston. And I lived in Preston for a year, about 5 years ago, and I was a big fan of PNE, Preston North End, and I was delighted to see that their logo was lifted for the TV show Ted Lasso. But this is just skimming the surface of an abundant and almost entirely unknown collection of heraldic artifacts. That is really one of the great resources, not just of the Committee on Heraldry, but of American ancestors. And it's one with advances in digitizing things, I hope we can be able to share more widely for scholarly purposes and more generally for members who really deserve to be able to enjoy the visual beauty as well as the interest of all kinds of heraldic material. So I want to close now with a summary of who we are and what we do before getting to the floor for questions. The Committee on Heraldry is a group of 9 volunteers, chaired by Ryan Woods, COO of American Ancestors. We comprise a partnership of heraldry scholars and genealogists, as well as a brilliant artist, Matthew Alderman, who's been doing the illustrations to the newest entries in the Roll of Arms. In quarterly meetings, we consider all applications for recording new arms or old arms for the Roll of Arms. Our members routinely speak on heraldry and related subjects outside American Ancestors, or like this webinar right here at American Ancestors. I've already detailed some of our current forthcoming publishing projects, and I've sketched other efforts, including publishing our roll of new arms recorded since the 1930s, digitizing more of the records in the heraldry collections, and other things. I want to close by pointing to one. It's really the most exciting thing in heraldry that's coming to Boston in 2024. One of the greatest traditions linking genealogy and heraldry is the International Congress of Genealogical and Heraldic Sciences, a biennial congress held mostly in Europe, dating back to 1929. For the first time ever, this Congress is coming to the United States, and it's coming right here to American Ancestors in Boston, and our Committee on Heraldry will be hosting it in Boston from September 24th to 28th, 2024. So again, the hosts are American Ancestors and other partners, but with the Committee on Heraldry integrally involved, particularly in the heraldic half of this Congress. It's a 4-day event with keynote speakers, receptions, exhibits, vendors, and a full education program of presentations on genealogy and heraldry with an emphasis on cross-fertilization between the two. The call for proposals for presenters has been open for several weeks, but I think the deadline is tomorrow. If anybody listening now is hearing about it just now, and you're inspired, go for it. You've still got a day. Registration for attendees will open in January. Now, we look forward to this as a great opportunity to reintroduce heraldry to a genealogical public. And I hope to see many of you from both worlds, genealogy and heraldry, there in the flesh in Boston next September, where among one of the things that I hope to do, it's going to be the first time to showcase some of the heraldry collections, the documents, manuscripts, and artifacts as part of the Congress, perhaps the first time that many of these things will be seen in decades. So I guess I've ended this by getting enthusiastic myself about next September's Congress, but I hope that the whole has been a worthwhile introduction to our committee. Thank you, Ginevra, for this opportunity to have me do this. And I'm happy to take questions, which I think have been piling up.
And they have. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for your presentation. And we're all looking forward to the Congress next September. And again, in your follow-up email, there will be a link to the Congress website if you'd like to learn more or to submit a paper for consideration. And again, the deadline is tomorrow, December 1st. So yes, we have quite a few questions. First, kind of thinking about some of the databases that you went over with the roll of arms, the index, thinking about how someone would practically use that in their research. Mark asks, so I gather we cross-reference our ancestors by surname and location with the roll of arms to see if they may belong to a heraldic line or a family. Is that kind of the idea, the first step?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's really about the heraldry. The point of the roll of arms is about the heraldry. It's not necessarily the first place to learn genealogical information about a particular ancestor or somebody you think may be an ancestor. But certainly for the more recent entries in the roll of arms, those published in the last 20, 30 years, there's a lot of information given in those entries, which might give you more, and certainly each of those entries is going to be based on the conclusion that that person is known, his ancestry is known at least far enough back to connect to somebody who used a coat of arms. Now, in some cases, that's only one generation or two generations or even one generation. There are, I think, some people in the roll of arms who immigrated from countries with no heraldic regulation, but who were documented to have used a coat of arms before they came over and after they came over. So that doesn't necessarily give you genealogical information on those people, but at the very least, those entries will certainly cite some of the information on which the conclusion is based. And we do, on occasion, field queries about people who are in the roll of arms where somebody wants to know a little more. Some of the operating records do go into greater depth. I think I might have glossed over it, but some entries in the roll of arms, particularly from that earlier period, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, have since been disproven based on new genealogical information. And those are represented by an asterisk in the name index. And they should be represented by a subsequent note in the published version of the roll of arms saying, oh, this has been shown to be incorrect. So you're not necessarily going to use the roll of arms as a first resource for researching genealogy, but it should give you a lot of clues about what to do next.
And Mark also asks, is that American Ancestors database free to members, free to non-members? I can answer that. It is a database for dues-paying members, but the index that Dr. Taylor also discussed is freely available on the committee site. So if you want to see kind of, again, the just a full listing by surname, that's available free on the website. Mark also asks, are the books identical to the online database, and are there other heraldic databases to check or look into?
Yeah, so I don't think we have other databases that are explicitly heraldic yet. No, I'm sorry, that's not true. The Gore roll is represented, that's forthcoming as a facsimile. This is the manuscript from the 1720s, is accessible as a database, searchable, and that will pull you up the specific painted coat of arms from the Gore roll and a very small amount of information. And it will also pull up the textual information that have been published in the 1930s by Dr. Bowditch on that coat of arms as well. But again, that's not freely accessible to non-members. I think that it's among the default databases that require a dues-paying membership to view.
And so Karen asks, if my ancestor's coat of arms is in the roll of arms, can I claim it as my own?
Well, I think there are different definitions of what you mean by claiming a coat of arms as your own. Traditionally, coats of arms descended in the male line. So if a coat of arms of a male line ancestor is in the roll of arms, then by traditional, both British and most other European heraldic conventions, yes, you can say this is my coat of arms as well. For many of us, I'm in the category where I have some remote colonial ancestors, I think 2 or 3, who are in the roll of arms, but they're not my Taylor ancestors. So their coat of arms are not, I can't think of them as my coat of arms, but I can all certainly say, yes, I'm pleased to to be able to demonstrate my descent from, somebody who did have a coat of arms, through many generations of intervening people. So it's how you consider that to be your ownership is a little bit different.
Now, you've kind of discussed throughout the presentation, you've mentioned modern coats of arms. Robert says, I recorded my personal arms a few years ago. However, since modern recorded arms have not been published, neither on the committee's website nor in written form, and no certificate is provided, what is the ultimate point or goal of recording arms assumed in modern times? And it sounds like they are recorded in the annual report. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they've always been recorded, and we have Mr. Kohler's coat of arms in our paper records. This is one of the projects where I very much hope that we will publish retroactively, but in textual form, probably not with illustrations, which are expensive and time consuming, all the new or modern coats of arms that have been brought to us for record. There were periods in the past in the relatively recent past, say 20 to 40 years ago, where people bringing coats of arms for, or even more recently than that, 10 years ago, people bringing coats of arms for record, paid a nominal fee, and got perhaps only a terse message of acknowledgement. We do now give a more formal certificate that these arms have been placed on record with indication of their annual publication. And this is something that we're actively working on, extending retrospectively to all those who came to us with exactly the same thing in prior years. It's something that's going to take us a while to get to. On request, we have been able to issue retroactive letters. They're not certificates illustrated with those arms, but they are letters to confirm the record of arms. Effectively, all registries of coats of arms, the service they provide is kind of like registering a copyright. You're able to demonstrate to others that, yes, this is your coat of arms, you designed it, you received it in some other way as of a certain year. It's supposed to, in the older culture, protect you from somebody else stealing your coat of arms. Now, I don't think that's a very high risk in modern society. But that's really one of the traditional reasons for doing this. But I think people have brought many different reasons to us for doing it.
And kind of a continuation of that question, or maybe piggybacking off of that question. In the meantime, we have a question. I had my familial inherited arms registered with the committee in 2009. How can I go about getting documentation for that registration?
Oh, okay. So for people who just want to sort of check up on things, and particularly in this period, sort of 6 to 20 or so years ago, you're welcome to contact us directly. And I think that you've got, so the slide you have up, Ginevra, says, oh, if you questions, research services, research@neh.org, nehgs.org. I would encourage people to contact the committee directly using the email address heraldry@nehgs.org. And this would, one of the things we do on occasion is respond to a request for a kind of retrospective confirmation for people who registered arms several years ago, but didn't get back from us the same kind of formal document that we generate now. And I'm happy to discuss that. Some of our paper files, although, I've got a, the caveat is that our paper files are not accessible while the building is undergoing such extensive renovations. So it's going to be frustrating because people are going to have to wait a few months if you come to us with that kind of query right now. But the stuff is all there, and I'm just itching to get my hands on it again when the building reopens.
And the answer to this question might be another kind of wait and see. David asks, what is necessary to obtain access to the digitized Promptuarium Armorum?
Yeah, so at current, I actually don't have a complete images of it myself right now. It's something that is really kind of contact us, and that's a scholar to scholar thing. We're not distributing it. Obviously, it will end up as a database on American ancestors, but we're certainly happy to facilitate research requests that are related to it for a specific purpose.
Robert asks, where can I view the annual reports of the committee?
Yeah, so the annual reports for the last 2-3 years are one of the things linked from our page, the Committee on Heraldry's page at American Ancestors. I think, and this might be oversight, that when I last looked, the report for 2022 is not up, but the report for 2022 exists, and I should make sure that it's been put online. The report for 2023 will follow very, very shortly. And those are simple PDF documents. They're not indexed in the database system at American Ancestors. This, along with retrospective indexing of all the new or modern arms we've recorded. Again, this is one of our projects that we hope to move forward on. But for now, it's really just the formal textual record of all arms accepted in each given calendar year. And it's only for 2020 and years more recently than that at this time.
Maybe a few final but related questions related to the College of Arms. Is there a database that's available for the College of Arms, similar to what we showed maybe for the Roll of Arms? And also, will they be in attendance at the Congress, and do we work with them closely or often?
Well, that's actually a good question, and well, several good questions rolled up into one. One of the members of our committee is a sitting herald in the College of Arms, Peter O'Donoghue, the York Herald. He's somebody I feel very privileged and grateful to work with as a scholar, as a colleague. And it's an interesting evolution because for the 170 years that this committee has existed, we have had very cordial relations with heraldic officials in different European countries, as well as other scholars elsewhere. And most of the time that's been, interaction has been by correspondence. But the wonders of the 21st century and Zoom and the pandemic, we realized that, well, we could actually get these guys on the horn. And Peter O'Donoghue, the York Herald, has very graciously come aboard as a regular member of our committee. And it's an invaluable link with very specific research queries and cases that we end up having great discussions about. A broader, really good question about, is everybody whose arms might be on record somewhere at the College of Arms, is there some wonderful database with which to get that information? The answer is, alas, no. There's a very good book called Armigerous Ancestors, which I talked about in my last webinar from September, and it was, I think it was a bibliography item in the resource guide there. This is not accessible online. It was published in 1999 or 2000, and it's one of the handiest kind of meta indexes to all coats of arms from the era of visitations in England. There are similar books for Scotland and for other major heraldic jurisdictions. There are analogous resources, but there is no handy-dandy one-world resource for all coats of arms that have ever existed. And yes, it would be marvelous if there were. There might have been other parts of that question. I can't remember.
If they're attending the Congress?
Oh, yes. I expect that one or more of our colleagues from the College of Arms will attend, and I know that other heraldic officials from other realms that have government heralds do plan to attend. The biennial Congress, of which this is just going to be the latest installment, almost always has both government heraldic officials from various different countries around the world that do heraldry, as well as a real kind of eclectic and vibrant gathering of scholars with different interests. So yes, come here to see those folks as well next September.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Taylor, for your presentation and for answering all of your questions. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all of the questions asked, but as mentioned, you can reach out to Heraldry at nehgs.org. You'll also be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the syllabus and resource guide that Dr. Taylor mentioned. There will also be a link to the Congress if you'd like to learn more information and perhaps submit a paper or bookmark it, so when registration opens, you're among the first to register. Or if, of course, you'd like to learn more about your family history, you can also book a consultation with our experts at consultations@nehgs.org. You can hire our research services team at research@nehgs.org. Or if you just have a reference question about heraldry, family history, or another reference question, you can use our free chat with a genealogist service at americanancestors.org/chat. So thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any feedback is very useful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more. And if you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org. Also in the video library on our website, that's where you'll find a recording of the September session that Dr. Taylor was mentioning as well, an introduction to heraldry for genealogists. So thank you again, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.